Hello and welcome to this lecture, brief lecture I think, on liberalism and the state. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline, to begin with, the attitude towards the state that all liberals agree on, what they agree on, and then I'm going to go through some specific liberal thinkers and outline their specific contributions, their particular views on the state. And when I would say the state, I mean what is the kind of legitimate role, what are the legitimate roles and responsibilities of a state, I suppose, what I'm talking about. Okay, so to begin with, all liberals believe in constitutionalism. That is to say, in the need for a constitution outlining the government's powers and the citizens' rights. This is to ensure that governments are not able to abuse their powers and breach the individual freedoms of their citizens. This is also known as the principle of limited government. But there are major disagreements amongst liberals over what exactly government should be limited to. So, to begin with, John Locke. In the 17th century, John Locke argued for what has become known as a minimal state, or a night watchman state. Locke argued essentially that the state was a necessary evil. As a believer in individual liberty, he was naturally suspicious of the state, whose raison d'etre, that is, its reason to exist, was to limit individual liberty. However, he was not an anarchist. He did believe a state was necessary in order to guarantee and maximize freedom. Although he believed that in the state of nature, a society without government, people would by and large respect one another's natural rights, he nevertheless argued that rational human beings would consent to a government to regulate disputes and ensure that those rights were fully upheld. So in other words, Locke believed that in the state of nature things would be okay, life would be tolerable, people would by and large respect each other's natural rights. They had a kind of God-given innate sense of right of wrongs, the idea of natural law. So they were kind of, they would get along okay. But he nevertheless believed that being rational, people would understand that actually if there were a set of laws, regulations and so on to ensure and guarantee that natural rights were upheld and institutions to ensure that happened, in other words a state, they would agree to that, and that would be an improvement. So he believed a state could actually and should function to ensure that people's natural rights are fully respected and upheld more than they would be in the state of nature. They would understand it to be in their rational self-interest, he argued, to consent to the sacrifice of a little of their individual liberty for the sake of the security that a state provides. So long as the state upheld and respected the people's natural rights to life, liberty and property, he argued, the people had a duty to obey the state. This was termed the social contract. And as we know, of course, if the state breaks that contract by not upholding those rights to life, liberty and property, then of course the people are no longer bound by their side of the contract. They no longer have a duty to obey. They have the right actually to overthrow the state. However, Locke's form of individualism, known as egotistical individualism, emphasized individual self-reliance and therefore believed that the state's role should be kept to a minimum. To be precise, the minimum necessary to uphold people's natural rights to life, liberty and property. So pause the video here and think, if you can, about what kind of things Locke would believe would be justified for the state to do if their only legitimate role was to do whatever was necessary to uphold the rights to life, liberty and property. Okay, pause the video, have a think. Okay, did you get a few ideas? So things that would be a legitimate role for the state in Locke's view would be things like an army for defense against the invasion. Obviously that's about upholding the right to life. Things like some kind of criminal justice system, possibly police, prisons, court system, to uphold and enforce the law. And also a system of civil courts, so that freely negotiated contracts could be upheld and enforced and disputes dealt with and so on. But beyond that, really, the state should keep out of people's lives. That was Locke's view. So, for example, individual freedom demanded that the state should not interfere in the private sphere of people's religious and political beliefs, for example, or their lifestyle and career choices, But additionally, any paternalistic attempts by the state to use taxes to provide social welfare, for example, were seen as illegitimate infringements of property rights. Individuals were seen as possessing not only rights but responsibilities also, and the state should not therefore provide things which were seen properly as the responsibility of the individual, as this could only be done by illegitimately taxing the property of other individuals. If the state, for example, to provide healthcare and schooling for its citizens in a classic, original, classical Lockean view of the state, this is illegitimate. It's each family's, it's each person's own responsibility to provide those things for themselves. Self-reliance. Yeah, it's not the state's responsibility, and if the state were to do it, it would have to raise taxes on people, and that would be an infringement of property rights. 200 years later, the liberal T.H. Green, however, developed a very different view of the state. Whilst he shared Locke's constitutionalism, as I said, as do all liberals, he argued that what was needed was not a minimal state, but what he termed an enabling state. Green believed in positive freedom, which he termed as, quote, the liberation of the powers of all men equally for contributions to the common good. So for Green, freedom did not consist only of being left alone by the state, which Isaiah Berlin had termed negative freedom. For Green, freedom meant the ability to fully develop one's individual capacities and talents, to truly flourish and express one's individuality. And obstacles to achieving this freedom emanated not only from the state. Things like poverty and illiteracy were much more likely to prevent the working class from developing their talents than, for example, government censorship. Indeed, for an illiterate, freedom of the press, for example, was pretty meaningless. And was the impoverished son of a Victorian miner who happened to have a flair for classical violin really in a position to develop this talent? Of course not. So for Green, what was needed was an enabling state that would tackle the obstacles to freedom, such as poverty, illiteracy, and ill health. The state's job was not to keep out of people's lives, but where necessary to step in to ensure equality of opportunity, that everyone had the opportunity to fully develop their talents and capacities. This meant, of course, a much higher degree of state intervention than had been envisaged by classical liberals like Locke, as it meant state-funded schools, public health programs, and potentially social welfare, as well as regulations on working conditions and housing conditions and so on and so forth. John Rawls, in his 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, built on Green's ideas to provide a liberal justification, hang on, my computer's gone funny, for a fully developed welfare state with a high level of redistribution. He argued that justice effectively meant fairness, but that society as it stood at present was very unfair. The problem was that as people were self-interested, it was difficult to reach agreement on what distributive principles really were fair. Wealthy people saw high taxes as unfair, whilst the poor viewed the fact that they were condemned to live in the most dangerous, polluted and neglected areas as deeply unfair. Able-bodied people might feel it unfair to have to pay taxes towards facilities for the disabled, but the disabled themselves would see a lack of such as facilities as unfair towards them. So to overcome this problem of what is fair being different, seen differently by different people depending on their position in society, to overcome this, Rawls proposed a novel thought experiment. He suggested that the redistributive principles chosen by someone completely ignorant of their own position in society would be the principles that would be the most fair. So in other words, if someone was somehow had their mind kind of emptied, all their memories wiped out, they had no idea who they were, they had no idea if they are rich or poor, black or white, even male or female, able-bodied or disabled, if they had no idea who they were, what their position in society was or was going to be, the principles that they said of distribution, what they believed would be fair because they wouldn't be influenced by self-interest, because they wouldn't know what their position was, so that they wouldn't be able to come up with a position based on self-interest. So he called this the original position, people's position before they're actually part of society, if you like. And in this original position, as he termed it, people would not risk choosing principles that would leave them completely ruined if they turned out to be poor, disabled, or otherwise disadvantaged. They would therefore favour a high level of wealth redistribution, he argued, to ensure that things like decent housing, healthcare and education were available to all. They wouldn't take the risk of saying, no, the state shouldn't provide education, because then if it turned out they were someone who was too poor to afford education for their children, then obviously there'd be a big disadvantage. So people in the original position, he argued, would always argue for quite high levels of redistribution as a kind of insurance policy, in case they would end up being someone who needed it. For Rawls, therefore, the state had a responsibility to ensure social justice through the provision of social goods paid for by relatively high taxes on the wealthy. So that was Rawls' justification in 1971 for really quite a highly developed welfare state, a quite generous redistributive welfare state, more generous than the type that T.H. Green envisaged. T.H. Green envisaged more of what's sometimes called a safety net, so people don't sink below a certain level. Rawls advocated something more than that, quite a generous redistributive welfare state. And of course he was writing in 1971 in that period of the post-war consensus, when these kind of states, at least in Europe, were kind of the norm, these quite generous welfare states. Okay, J.S. Mill, we're moving back in time a little bit to the previous century again, back to the 19th century, to look at J.S. Mill. J.S. Mill was effectively a bridge between the classical liberalism of Locke and the modern liberalism of T.H. Green, supporting a largely free market economy but with inheritance tax and some state intervention to support the poor and provide education. That's through most of his life. He actually became, in the end, almost something towards a socialist. But that was much later in the day. Mill's main contribution to liberal thinking on the state was, in fact, on the issue of democracy. Mill's major concern was the need to protect minorities from what he termed the tyranny of the majority and dull conformity. Minority viewpoints, he argued, were necessary not only on principle, the principle of individual liberty, to express one's view, however at odds it may be with mainstream society, but this was also necessary for social progress. It was only through rational debate between conflicting ideas that ideas evolved and humanity moved forward. Without dissenting opinions, he believed society would essentially stagnate. But minorities were particularly under threat from the so-called tyranny of the majority. Although he supported women's suffrage, Mill was very concerned about the working class gaining the vote. If the government was determined by the uneducated masses, as Mill saw them, they might very well pass laws which discriminated against minority groups. Especially at risk were the property rights of the wealthy. A working class majority electorate, Mill believed, would likely elect a government almost like a communist government, which would expropriate the property of the rich. Mill put forward a multitude of proposals for checks and balances to guard against this danger, including proportional representation and plural voting, which is the idea that everyone should have up to 4 votes depending on their level of education. So the least educated get 1 vote, the most educated get 4 votes, and other people in between. This would, he argued, help prevent the danger of the votes of the educated being swamped by those of the uneducated. So, and this was a big issue for liberals in the 19th century, the danger of democracy. There was this real fear amongst liberals that if you had universal adult suffrage, the majority, the kind of uneducated majority, would basically impose politics that would not necessarily be in line with liberal ideals, right? That would potentially infringe on all kinds of minority rights and property rights and so on. So there was this big fear within liberalism, that liberalism itself, the liberal state itself, would be under threat from democratic enfranchisement of the uneducated masses. And that was Mill's solution: give more votes to the better educated. Finally, for the feminist liberals Mary Wollstonecraft and Betty Friedan, the state had a duty to uphold women's equality. For Wollstonecraft, this meant granting women full legal equality and making the institution of marriage a partnership of equals rather than the transfer of women's property and legal rights to the husband that it was in her time. She also believed that the state had a duty to ensure female education. We should also mention that as a Republican, she believed in the abolition of the monarchy and was strongly opposed to the power of the aristocracy, which she saw as an anti-democratic force bent on undermining the elected House of Commons. By Betty Friedan's time, this was in the 1960s, Mary Wollstonecraft was in the 1790s that she was writing a lot of her work. By Friedan's time, several laws had been passed outlawing discrimination against women, but the problem was they were not always enforced. So this prompted Friedan to set up the National Organization of Women, the NOW, in the US to campaign for the enforcement of anti-discrimination laws and against the gender prejudices which still existed at the time. It could be argued that there was a parallel between the difference between the negative and positive freedom of Locke and Green on the one hand and the differing demands of Wollstonecraft on the other, of Wollstonecraft and Friedan on the other. As Wollstonecraft saw most of the obstacles to female equality coming from the state, her demands were mainly that the state should stop discriminating against women. By Friedan's time, it was apparent that discrimination emanated from other quarters as well, such as employers and general social prejudice. She therefore argued that the state needed to do more than simply refrain from discriminating against women itself. It needed to step in and take positive action to prevent others doing so. In a similar way that Green realised 200 years after Locke, that the state, it wasn't just about the state stepping out of people's lives, it might need to step in to ensure that other obstacles to freedom were dealt with. In sum, liberals have differing views on the state. In particular, classical and modern liberals disagree deeply on the degree to which the state should be involved in providing social goods such as health, welfare and education. What unites all liberals, however, is the basic belief in limited government, that individual liberties must be upheld and the state's powers limited by a constitution. And all liberals believe in the idea that citizens' rights must be protected, and that there's an idea within liberalism that there's the public sphere, that's what the areas in which the government is legitimately entitled to make laws, and then there's the private sphere, which is things that are the no one's business but the individuals themselves. And all liberals believe that things like political beliefs, religious beliefs, so on, lifestyle choices more or less, all of those things would come under the private sphere, and therefore the state would have no right to interfere in that realm, have laws discriminating against people because of their beliefs, choices, lifestyles, etc. in those areas. So yeah, constitutionalism, the limited government, and the idea that the government should keep out of the private sphere of people's religious, political beliefs and so on. All liberals agree on that in terms of the state. Where they disagree in general is the degree to which the state should be involved in actually helping to provide for people, helping people to overcome the obstacles to their individual liberty emanating from other areas of social life. Okay, thanks for listening. There's nothing more to this video, just my computer won't let me stop it. You can stop watching.